The chamber reeked of burnt flesh and sterilized metal. Harsh white lights bore down from the ceiling, their intensity calibrated not for visibility, but for cruelty. In the center of the room, strapped to an angular interrogation slab, lay the human. Blood slicked the edges of his cracked lips. His right eye was swollen shut, the left barely managing to glare at the towering figures surrounding him. The warlords, brutal conquerors of the Dominion, had spent hours prying into his body, searching for the breaking point of his species. So far, they had not found it. A hulking warlord stepped forward. His 4 crimson eyes gleamed with amusement, his mandibles clicking in satisfaction. His exoskeletal frame was adorned in battle scars, each jagged ridge a testament to centuries of conquest. "You still resist," he mused, running a claw down the length of the human's exposed arm. "Curious. Your species has never encountered true suffering, and yet you endure." The human swallowed iron. His voice, when it came, was hoarse but steady. "I've had worse hangovers." Laughter rippled through the gathered warlords. It was a deep, guttural sound, like stone grinding against bone. Another warlord, taller than the rest, loomed over him. A commander, by the insignia carved into his armor. His name was Vorik, and he had personally orchestrated the fall of a dozen civilizations. His voice was a deliberate growl, the kind that preceded executions. "Your defiance is meaningless," Vorik stated, unhurried. "We have crushed empires that stood for millennia. What makes you think your fledgling species is any different?" The human's breath was shallow, but his lips curled into something resembling a smirk. "Because you're asking that question." The chamber fell silent. Vorik's mandibles twitched. "You believe yourself special?" "No," the human admitted. He licked blood from his teeth, eyes locking onto Vorik's. "I believe you made a mistake." Vorik scoffed. "Your arrogance is amusing." A warlord at his side tapped into a console, bringing up a holographic display. Lines of data scrolled across the screen, alongside distorted transmission logs. Vorik gestured to it. "We intercepted your distress beacon before you were captured. There will be no rescue." He leaned in, his breath rancid with the scent of raw meat. "Earth will never know what happened to you." The human exhaled slowly, shaking his head. His muscles ached, his ribs protested, but the smallest chuckle escaped his lips. "You think I called for help?" The warlords exchanged glances. Vorik's eyes narrowed. The human's grin widened, and in that moment, Vorik realized something was very, very wrong. "Play the transmission," Vorik ordered. The warlord at the console hesitated. "Sir, it's encoded." Then decode it. A flicker of static filled the chamber as the transmission crackled to life. The message was brief. A series of numbers, coordinates, then a voice. The same voice as the man before them, but steady, calm. "Target acquired. Proceed as planned." A cold silence settled over the room. Vorik's fingers tightened into a fist. "What is this?" The human's restraints groaned as he shifted, his body failing, but his resolve sharp. "That," he rasped, "wasn't a distress call. That was a confirmation." Vorik's head snapped toward the warlord at the console. "Trace the origin of that signal." The warlord's fingers flew across the controls. A moment later, the screen pulsed red. His voice wavered. It originated from inside our stronghold." Vorik's mind raced. That was impossible. No human ship had breached their defenses. No foreign technology had slipped past their scanners. And yet, the evidence was right in front of him. The human scout had not been calling for rescue. He had been calling for execution. The chamber's lights flickered. The console warlord's mandibles parted, confusion lacing his tone. "Sir, I'm picking up." A deafening explosion tore through the fortress. The floor trembled. Alarms shrieked to life, their piercing wail reverberating through the corridors. Vorik's soldiers reached for their weapons, their instincts sharpening. But it was already too late. Another explosion. Closer. The warlords turned toward the human, only to find his grin unchanged. "You were saying?" he asked. Vorik's mind reeled. The implications settled into his bones like poison. This was not a simple prisoner. This was bait, and the trap had already been sprung. From somewhere deep within the fortress, the sound of distant gunfire began. And then, silence. A silence Vorik recognized all too well. The kind that came before an enemy made themselves known. The human let out a slow breath, his smile never fading. "You should have killed me sooner." Vorik had known war for centuries. He had orchestrated planetary subjugations, reduced entire civilizations to ash, and stood triumphant over the corpses of countless enemies. Yet, as the alarms howled through the stronghold, as the walls shuddered beneath the force of distant explosions, he felt something he had not known since his first campaign: unease. The chamber was a cacophony of motion. Warlords barked commands, scrambling for weapons, while others pored over holographic displays, desperate to make sense of what was happening. The human, still strapped to the interrogation slab, merely watched. His breathing was labored, but his smirk remained intact, a silent testament to the inevitability of what was unfolding. Vorik turned to the warlord at the console. "Status report. Unknown force has breached the lower sectors." The warlord stammered, fingers darting across the interface. "They're moving fast, non-Dominion signatures. Their tactics are erratic. Vorik nearly crushed his own claws in frustration. No, this was not erratic. This was something far worse. It was human. The fortress trembled again. This time, the detonation was closer. Vorik's subordinates tensed, fingers tightening around their weapons. A transmission from the barracks flickered onto the main display. Grainy, distorted visuals revealed a corridor choked in smoke. The bodies of Dominion warriors slumped against the walls. Something moved in the haze, a flicker of motion, low to the ground. A shadow darted between cover, too fast for the sensors to lock onto. Then nothing. The feed cut to static. Vorik clenched his jaw. His soldiers were dying, and they didn't even know by what. His gaze snapped back to the human. "How many?" Vorik demanded. The human blinked, blood-matted lashes barely lifting. "Enough." A warlord growled and drove a clawed fist into the human's gut. The human convulsed against his restraints, but even through the pain, he laughed. The warlord snarled. "What is the objective? What is your force after?" The human sucked in a breath, shaking his head. "You still think this is a rescue mission?" The chamber's entrance hissed open, and a Dominion officer staggered inside, clutching his side. Dark, viscous blood seeped between his fingers. His mandibles clicked erratically as he tried to speak. They're inside the ventilation systems," he wheezed. A deafening crack cut through the air. The officer's head snapped backward, a fine mist of purple spraying across the chamber walls. His body crumpled. A second shot rang out. The warlord at the console slumped forward. A neat hole burned through the back of his skull. Panic seized the room. The warlords pivoted, weapons raised, but there was nothing. No enemy to face, no attacker to retaliate against. Vorik's gut twisted. Snipers. Inside his own fortress. He slammed a fist against the console, switching the fortress-wide comms to an open channel. "This is Vorik," he snarled. "All units, form defensive positions. Flood the corridors with gas. If they have lungs, we choke them out." The chamber's ventilation systems hissed to life, spewing thick, caustic vapor. Vorik turned back to the human, expecting to see his defiance crack, expecting to see the first signs of fear. Instead, the human exhaled slowly, as if savoring the air, as if he knew something Vorik did not. Then the lights died. Darkness swallowed the chamber. The warlord's eyes, accustomed to the sterile brightness of their ship, struggled to adjust. Their exoskeletal armor emitted a faint bioluminescent glow, but in the pitch black, It made them targets more than anything else. Vorik knew this. He knew the enemy knew this. A sound, a whisper of movement, a guttural scream, then another. Gunfire erupted in sporadic bursts. Muzzle flashes illuminated the carnage in frozen fragments. A warlord being yanked into the vents, his limbs flailing before disappearing into the abyss. Another warrior dropping to the ground, a jagged combat knife buried to the hilt in his throat. This was not an assault. This was eradication. Vorik pivoted, claws swiping through the darkness. But the enemy was never where he expected. Shadows moved against shadows, each figure blending seamlessly with the pitch-black chaos. His warriors were falling faster than he could register. He turned toward the human, only to find the interrogation slab empty. The restraints hung loose, the locks pried open with meticulous precision. A trail of blood led away from the slab, vanishing into the darkness. Vorik cursed. He had underestimated them. Again, the fortress trembled once more, but this time it was different. Not an explosion, a sequence detonation. Vorik's eyes darted to the remaining screens. Multiple red markers flickered across the fortress map, each one positioned near vital infrastructure. Power cores, reactor stabilizers, life support systems. This wasn't an assault. It was demolition. They hadn't come to take back their scout. They had come to make sure no warlord left this place alive. Vorik felt the weight of inevitability settle upon him. He had spent his life studying war, believing himself the master of all battle. But what he faced now was not war. It was something else entirely. It was humanity in its purest form. The kill order had been given, and they were executing it flawlessly. The doors to the chamber blew inward, sending molten debris scattering across the floor. Vorik barely had time to react before something struck him. A body, smaller than his but moving with impossible speed. The impact sent him sprawling, his weapon skidding from his grasp. He rolled, slashing out blindly, but his opponent was already gone. Footsteps echoed in the dark. A voice followed, low and calm. "I told you." A shadow emerged from the smoke, the faint gleam of a blood-stained knife catching the dim emergency lights. The human scout stood before him, and he was smiling. Vorik surged to his feet, mandibles flaring in fury. The human scout, bloodied, battered, and very much free, stood before him, knife in hand, illuminated only by the flickering red emergency lights. Shadows stretched long across the ruined chamber, the air thick with smoke, the scent of ozone and blood interwoven like a battlefield dirge. Around them, the fortress burned. The warlords that had once stood at Vorik's side lay in twitching heaps, their bodies torn apart by silent killers lurking in the darkness. His fortress, his command, his warlords, all undone in mere minutes. And standing at the center of it all, smirking through split lips and bruised flesh, was a single human. Vorik reached for his weapon, but the human was faster. A sharp snap echoed through the chamber as the scout lashed out with his boot, sending the Dominion commander's firearm skittering across the blood-slicked floor. Vorik lunged, claws swiping in a brutal arc, but the human ducked, fluid and practiced. A counterstrike, his knife slashing upward, carve across Vorik's exoskeletal plating, not deep enough to kill, but precise enough to find the gaps between, precise enough to hurt. Pain flared through Vorik's side. He staggered back, snarling. "You think this changes anything?" The human rolled his shoulders, shifting his grip on the knife. "I think you're out of warlords." Vorik's mandibles twitched. He wasn't wrong. A burst of gunfire rattled in the distance, followed by the guttural screams of dying Dominion warriors. The fortress-wide comms were flooded with panicked transmissions, desperate calls for reinforcements, only to be met with static or the sharp, brutal crack of another lost life. Vorik's forces were being hunted. He narrowed his four crimson eyes, studying the human before him. His stance, his confidence, the ease with which he had freed himself despite his injuries. A scout. That was the official designation the Dominion had given these humans, low-tier combatants, unworthy of classification beyond reconnaissance roles. Yet this scout had crippled an entire stronghold. No, not alone. Vorik saw it now. Humans didn't fight alone. The attack had not been one of overwhelming force. No grand fleet had descended from a void. No legions of armored soldiers had stormed the gates. Instead, they had sent in a small team, infiltrators, tacticians, killers. And they had done more damage than an armada. The human took a step forward. Vorik tensed, anticipating another attack. But instead, the scout simply tilted his head. "You thought I was calling for help." The words were quiet, yet razor sharp. "That's your whole problem, isn't it?" Vorik bared his fangs. "Elaborate. You're used to enemies that beg for mercy, that plead for reinforcements." The human gestured loosely toward the chaos unfolding beyond the chamber. "You don't know what to do when we're the ones coming for you." A deep, primal instinct twisted inside Vorik's gut. He refused to name it fear. Not yet, but it was something close. His kind had spent centuries subjugating weaker species, thriving on terror, dominating those too afraid to resist. The Dominion was a war machine, an empire built on absolute control. Humans didn't fear them. Humans fought like predators. A distant explosion rocked the structure, sending a rain of dust from the ceiling. Vorik could hear the fortress groaning, metal beams bending under stress. The detonations had been strategic, targeting support columns, power conduits. They weren't just raiding the stronghold. They were bringing it down. His grip on the situation was slipping, unraveling faster than he could compensate. The human saw it in him. He knew, and that damnable grin remained. Vorik needed to act. Now, he lunged again, this time with calculated precision. His clawed arms lashed forward, forcing the human to sidestep, and that was when he struck with his secondary limbs, a hidden pair of razor-edged appendages meant for gutting enemies in close quarters. But the human didn't falter, didn't stumble. Instead, he anticipated. He twisted sharply, stepping into the attack rather than away. The movement placed him too close for Vorik to properly angle his strike, disrupting the Dominion commander's balance. Then pain. The scout's knife plunged between the ridges of his lower torso armor, twisting deep into soft tissue. Vorik's body locked up, mandibles clicking involuntarily. His secondary limbs twitched, grasping at air, unable to complete their lethal arc. The human wrenched the blade free, stepping back as dark ichor dripped from the serrated edge. Vorik staggered, his vision blurred. No, he had fought for centuries. He had conquered worlds. He could not fall like this. But he knew, in the marrow of his bones, that he already had. The fortress let out a low, metallic groan, a death rattle. The detonation sequence was reaching its final stage. The humans had set their trap perfectly. Vorik's breathing was ragged. He stared at the scout, searching for something, anything, to justify how things had gone so wrong. And then the human did something Vorik had not expected. He crouched beside him, close enough that Vorik could see his eyes beneath the blood and sweat. Human eyes, not filled with hate, not filled with cruelty, just certainty. "You killed a scout," the human murmured, voice steady. "So we sent hunters." Vorik's limbs trembled. His mind fought against the truth. What was there, written in the ruins of his stronghold, in the silence of his dead warlords, in the way the human's hands did not shake as he readied his weapon for the final strike? This wasn't just another skirmish. This was retribution, and humans did not lose. Vorik's body refused to obey. His limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as if the weight of inevitability had finally settled upon them. The wound in his torso leaked thick, dark ichor, pooling beneath him in a slow-spreading stain. His fortress his empire's foothold on this world, shuddered around him, tremors running through the structure as explosions continued to detonate in sequence. The human scout remained close, watching him with an unsettling stillness. He had no reason to move, no reason to rush. The battle was already won. Vorik knew it now, even if his mind fought against the admission. A voice crackled through the human's earpiece. Status. The scout exhaled, slow and measured. Phase 3 complete. Exfil in 2. 2 minutes. That was all the time he needed. All the time he had ever needed. Vorik's mandibles twitched. His own kind would have been frantic in their final moments, clawing for survival, scrambling for any desperate act of defiance. The human did not. He was already prepared to leave, to vanish into the void, his mission completed with cold, calculated precision. And then he looked at Vorik again, expression unreadable. You still don't understand, do you? Vorik's breathing was labored. He forced words through gritted fangs. Enlighten me. The scout wiped his knife against his sleeve, the motion casual, routine. You thought taking me was a victory. His voice was quiet, but it carried over the distant echoes of destruction. That if you could break me, you'd learn what you needed. Strategies. Weaknesses. He sheathed the blade, tilting his head slightly. But the second you took me, you didn't just start a war. He stepped back. You started a hunt. Vorik's mind reeled, grasping at the implications. He had assumed the humans were merely another species to be conquered, that their worlds would fall like all the others had. But this was different. Their soldiers did not fight for conquest or power. They fought with something worse, something more dangerous than any empire's ambition. They fought for vengeance. A deep rumble vibrated through the floor. The fortress was entering its final collapse, its foundations sabotaged beyond repair. The air was thick with heat and smoke, the acrid stench of burning metal mingling with the sickly sweet scent of Dominion corpses. Vorik tried to rise, but his strength failed him. His body was betraying him, just as his warriors had fallen, just as his stronghold had crumbled around him. He had been outmatched, outthought, outmaneuvered. And the worst part, the part that burned deeper than any wound, was that it had never even been a fair fight. A transmission flickered to life on the emergency channel, distorted but unmistakable. The voice of a Dominion officer, panic seeping through every syllable. High Command, do you read? The fortress is lost. I repeat, the fortress is. The feed cut to static. Vorik closed his eyes. He had known this day would come, in some distant war, at some unknown battlefield. But he had never expected it to happen like this. Not like this. The scout touched his earpiece again. Ghost Team, clear the remaining sectors. We leave nothing standing. A new chorus of distant detonations followed, perfectly timed, perfectly placed. Vorik felt the last remnants of his empire crumble into dust. The human turned to leave. Vorik forced himself to speak, his voice raw with something dangerously close to fear. What are you? The scout hesitated in the threshold, silhouetted against the inferno beyond. He didn't look back when he answered. The thing you should have killed the moment you saw it. Then he was gone. Vorik lay there, listening to the slow, inevitable destruction of everything he had built. The last thing he saw before darkness swallowed him was the insignia painted in blood on the ruined walls. A single word, a single warning. Retribution.